We're looking at the Van Bergen Overmantel, and this is a painting that was done in 1733, done by John Heaton, and it depicts daily life on a Hudson Valley Dutch farm. It's historically important because it's the only known scene of everyday life among the Hudson Valley Dutch that's ever been found. It's the earliest known American genre painting or scene of everyday life, and it's the earliest known view of the Catskill Mountains. I'm Paul D'Ambrosio. I'm the Vice President and Chief Curator for the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. Now, as Vice President and Chief Curator, I oversee the exhibitions at the museum, both the ones that are done here inside the museum building itself, as well as those that we organize for travel elsewhere. We have exhibitions that travel across the country and sometimes overseas. I also oversee the collections department that keeps records on all of the 44,000 items in our collections, and conservation department that keeps things in good shape. I oversee the library and publications departments as well. We've got an 80,000 volume library that also has a lot of original manuscripts that really pertain to the history of New York State and this region of central New York in particular. American folk art is a pretty interesting topic because you've got to understand how that term developed in order to understand what it is that we're talking about. It is a term that really wasn't used in the time period when a lot of the items that we consider folk art were actually being produced. When we talk about folk art here at the museum, and we've got a large folk art collection, we're talking about items that were made by artists with no formal training in the fine arts. They might have been simple farmers, they might have been weavers, traveling craftspeople, they might even have been professional painters but working in a style that allowed them to appeal to the ordinary person in terms of either painting their portrait or a scene of their farm or house or village. These were people that were making a living, for the most part, when we're talking about it in the 18th and 19th centuries. We're talking about people that were making a living in the arts without having had any formal training because there was such a demand for things like bed coverings, portraits, and scenes that weren't being reproduced lithographically or with the camera. So it's a broad category, but it's a category that was really identified in the early 20th century, beginning with early modernist painters that were summering in Maine. Painters like Marsden Hartley and Robert Laurent, who were doing work that was reductive and more minimalist than the elaborate academic styles of the late 19th century. And then when they were shopping for antiques to fill their cabins with in Maine, they began to come across weather vanes and early portraits and carvings done by early folk artists. And they saw in those the same sort of tendency toward patterning or abstraction that they saw as a spiritual antecedent to what they were doing, or precedent, a spiritual precedent to what they were doing 100 years before they were doing it. And they really helped promote this material, and one of their friends helped organize the first folk art gallery in New York City and some of the early exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art and the Newark Museum on American primitive art, as it was known at that time. And it just gained in popularity to the point where it became a real phenomenon by the 1940s, certainly by the 1960s and 70s. At the same time, there were dealers in New York City that were looking for modern primitives, for contemporary artists working in a naive style. They were very influenced by the popularity in France of Henri Rousseau, the very famous French naive painter. And they were looking for the American Rousseau. And so you have simultaneously, and almost in a parallel development, an interest in historical art by untrained artists and an interest in contemporary primitive painting as well. And these two areas continue to develop along parallel tracks pretty much almost to the present day. And it's very interesting when you look at the difference between them because it reflects in a lot of ways the way that Europeans look at folk art, at what they call folk art. If you go to any sort of folk art museum in London or Paris, you may not find it all in one place. Much of the historical material is really in anthropological museums or in museums dedicated to peasant or folk life, and that's called popular art in a variety of languages. You see it in Sicily, you see it in France, you see it in England, and certainly in the Netherlands and in the northern European countries that really developed the idea of folk museums, outdoor museums. And then you see what they call naive art, which is ordinary people working in a style that is heavily patterned, two-dimensional, and very much like the contemporary folk artists that we see working today, but they're ordinary people that happen to work in a folk style. At the same time, there's a third category that's called art brut in France, or raw art. In the English-speaking world, it's referred to as outsider art. And this is the art of people who are socially or mentally marginal. Either they are in prison or in a psychiatric institution. They have some sort of, marginality about them that gives their work an incredible intensity of vision and a real, status of being completely outside the mainstream of day-to-day life in terms of the particular culture in which they exist. But in America, I think what you see that's a little bit different from Europe is a real melding of all of these categories into one broad category. Most of the Americans that either produced or consumed folk art in the 19th and 20th centuries were middle class. They weren't of a peasant class. They weren't of an aristocratic class. And so in America, I think you naturally would have a broader but diverse group of people represented by this body of work. And so it comes across in America as one big category, whereas in Europe, I don't think that you will see historical folk art mixed in with outsider art, with popular or with naive art done by contemporary people. They're really three separate categories, no matter where you go. And so it's a very different, I think, course of study in the United States than it is anywhere else. Painting in America really goes back a long way if you count the Spanish conquest of New Mexico. For our purposes, being a museum in the northeastern United States, the story of American folk painting goes back as far as the early 18th century. And a lot of the painting that was done at that time was produced in the Hudson River Valley of New York State, where the Dutch, forming a middle-class mercantile society, were really, I think, the perfect breeding ground for artists, because they had a class of people that had achieved in the New World and wanted those achievements documented and celebrated. And so from the very start, from that time period on, particularly in the Northeast, there was a great demand for portraits. And I think if you talk about American folk painting, the first thing you need to understand is the vast majority of it is portraiture. That seems to be an American preference. You even see highly trained artists like John Singleton Copley saying, were it not for portraiture, painting would not exist in this country. And he knew he wanted to be a historical painter, but the demand kept him working in portraiture. And it filters down to every level, to the point where there was such a demand for portraiture among the middle classes who couldn't afford a John Singleton Copley, that over the course of the later 18th century and into the 19th, right up until the mid-19th century, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of untrained portrait painters either roaming the countryside or setting up shop in villages, rural cities, places where there were not trained artists for the most part, and basically setting up in a tavern or a boarding house or some place where people could get to them, sometimes traveling from one house to another and painting portraits of ordinary people. often for as little as $5, $15 in the early 19th century. Not a small sum, but certainly affordable for a farm family that had come a long way from their roots and that had finally had a successful enterprise in their farm, and they had raised a certain number of children, and they wanted their achievements celebrated, even in what in relative terms would have been a modest scale. To them, these were great, records of who they were and where they came from. And often you'll see in these portraits a real sense of pride in terms of what they're wearing, how the people are posed, what might be in the background, what type of furniture they're seated on. They often will have a book or a Bible in their hands to signify that they are literate and pious. There are a real strong sense of the values that got them to where they are. And they didn't care as much about artistic style as they did about the likeness being a passable likeness, that it looked somewhat like them, and that it was believable, and that it communicated these values about themselves and about their family, and those would be really recorded in perpetuity. Particularly, I think, and most poignantly, portraits of children, because the infant mortality was so high that there was a big demand for portraits of children. Parents wanted them because you didn't know whether that child was going to live to adulthood. And there are some cases, and we have an example in our collection, where a portrait painter was summoned to a home where a child had died to paint that child's likeness before burial. And such is the attachment parents had with these children. We tend to think about people in an era of high infant mortality distancing themselves emotionally from their children as a defense mechanism from having to suffer too much grief. I don't believe that was the case. All evidence that I've seen indicates that there was a tremendous amount of attachment to these children, and that there was a significant amount of grief in the lives of ordinary early Americans that can be reflected in the demand for portraiture and the desire to get any portrait painter into the household to secure a likeness of that child. And that's part of the reason why there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of painters with absolutely no formal training at all. They might have learned how to mix paints from another painter and basically had some inclination to draw or paint. They couldn't be completely artless, obviously. And some of them actually started their careers as decorative painters. They would paint furniture or walls or signs, that sort of thing, and then branch out into portraiture. But they really had to be inventive. They had to figure out what they could do well and then how to emphasize their strengths in a portrait painting. Some of them were elaborate draftsmen and could do tremendous work in pencil. And so they would do paintings that didn't emphasize color, but that emphasized penmanship or pencil drawing. Others were tremendous colorists, and so you don't see fine detail in their paintings, but you see bold color. Others were just very good at conveying personality with simple facial cues, and you see those attributes in every sitter to the point where it almost looks like every sitter has a faint family resemblance to every other sitter by that artist, regardless of whether they're even related. So these artists were inventive in a lot of ways, and it says a lot about homegrown ingenuity, about entrepreneurship, because remember, this is about making a living. A lot of these artists developed formulas for their painting. They used similar types of poses. They painted in a similar way that allowed them to paint portraits faster and still have them be effective. Because the more portraits you paint, the more income you have. And so it's very simple. It's almost, it's artisanship in a broad sense. And if you look at the way that they made their paintings similar in order to make more of them, you almost have an early form of mass production in a way. Even though there's an artistry here, they're very much handmade. They're very much made by people with artistic inclinations. And when you look at them today and you look at the best of them, they really stand up in terms of aesthetics to the art being produced by artists who were trained in formal art academies. You just need to look at them with an eye toward understanding what it was that this artist had going for him or her and how they developed a style and made it effective and then perfected it over time. And some of these artists had long careers. Some of them worked for 30, 40, 50 years. I know of two examples where one artist was wheelchair bound his whole career, and yet he was an itinerant or traveling folk painter. That's Joseph Whiting Stock, worked in Massachusetts and eastern New York. John Brewster Jr. was born deaf and mute and had a painting career that lasted from the 1790s to at least the 1830s. And he was able to communicate by any number of means. This was before American Sign Language was even developed. And when you think of the communication that has to take place between a portrait painter and their sitter, it's quite remarkable what he accomplished. And so there was such a demand that people from all walks of life and people from varying backgrounds and even people who you wouldn't think would have a chance of succeeding in this line of work actually did quite well, because they happen to be terrific artists. You'll see actually traces in portrait painting of a lot of other types of folk painting that were also prevalent at this time. You'll see sitters sitting on decorated furniture. You'll see them with landscape backgrounds in the maybe a window view, or sometimes the sitter will be posed in a landscape setting. It alludes to the incredible range of folk arts that were produced and would have been visible in any American village in the early 19th century. You have, in terms of landscape painting, you'll have actual landscapes framed and hung on a wall, but you will also have wall murals done on dry plaster. Complete murals of sometimes exotic, sometimes local landscapes, filling entire rooms from floor to ceiling. Rufus Porter was one such artist. He worked in New Hampshire, and he actually wrote a series of essays for Scientific American on how to paint these landscapes. And so he popularized this art form. He wanted to improve it. And a lot of artists, or would-be artists, read these articles and went out and did room murals in this Rufus Porter style. They were meant to imitate expensive French wallpaper, scenic wallpaper, and they were a homegrown alternative. At the same time, Americans used inexpensive wood for their moldings and for their furniture, but they made it look like more expensive wood through graining. And a lot of these artists knew how to regrain pine to make it look like mahogany or rosewood. Very inventive at adding different types of grain and different coloration. And sometimes they had graining that didn't imitate any wood but was just purely decorative, with fan motifs and swirls. If you think about this period in American life, you tend to, at first, think of it as kind of a grim, colorless period. But when you see these objects preserved in museum collections, you have to think that any traveler going into an average American village in 1840 would have seen an absolute riot of color when you think of this painted furniture, grained furniture, painted walls, paintings hung on those walls. And I'm not even talking about the textiles yet. An incredible range of color and design that was the part of the average American's life. And it was all homemade, and it was all produced by untrained artists who developed skills in these various areas. This began to subside in the mid-19th century for a number of reasons. Mass-produced furniture made out of better woods or wood veneers became more affordable. Wallpaper became more affordable. Lithography replaced the hand-painted views of towns and villages and cities. And most importantly, the camera really nearly eliminated the need for painted portraiture by 1850. And a lot of the artists that had done either portraiture or these other forms of art simply went into other lines of work. A lot of portrait painters actually became daguerrean artists, creating those small daguerreotypes, which were very inexpensive and very, as you know, accurate in terms of their reproduction of the appearance of a sitter. After that, very few people would pay and sit for the length of time that it required to have a painted portrait. So all of these things, really technological advances, combined to diminish the consumer need for folk art really by the late 19th century. And that's why when you look at folk art as a continuum into the 20th century folk art really is not produced for a consumer market. It's more often produced as a result of a personal need on the part of an artist to communicate something to a perceived audience, either a close audience of friends and family or a perceived audience of people outside his or her community. Sometimes it's for a community itself, but it's much more personal than 19th century folk art, which tends to be created to meet a demand. One of the earliest paintings in our collection is dated to the 1730s, and it's not a portrait. It's a scene of everyday life. There's a French word for this. We call it genre painting. Genre is a French word for type. And genre paintings in the academic sense were scenes of everyday life, typical people, typical situations, often with a touch of humor. And you'll see academic painters in America like William Sidney Mount and Eastman Johnson doing scenes of rural life and farm life in America, often done at a time when that way of life was beginning to fade. And so there is a sense of looking back at a way of life that was gone. In American folk art, you don't get that sense at all. And there are a lot of American folk artists that document everyday life by painting detailed scenes, street scenes, parade scenes, celebrations, weddings, set in a particular place, a town, a village, a street that they knew well. The folk paintings differ significantly from the academic paintings in a number of ways. Folk artists are very, very particular about specificity. And when a folk artist paints a scene, more often than not, it's a specific locale and it's a specific event or activity that that artist either witnessed or heard about firsthand or knew something in detail about, or was painting for someone that knew that event and experienced it and knew it in detail. And so what we find with folk paintings of everyday life is that they're great historical documents as well as great works of art. More often than not, the folk artist's observations can be borne out in the historical record when we do have the opportunity to compare them with that record. Academic artists, using their training, distilled an awful lot of information and took more artistic license to create an effective composition, which is what their patrons really expected. A patron of a folk painting of everyday life wanted it as accurate as possible. And so you see a lot of detail, closely observed, put into these paintings, and it makes them very lively and very rich, and certainly historically very important. And we see a real thread of genre painting from this 1730s painting, which is a Dutch farm, right up into the 19th century when every town and village had to have either a bird's eye view or some painting of a particular celebration, or tavern, life in a tavern, or hunting scene. Hunting scenes were popular, weddings, funerals, right up into the 20th century with artists like Grandma Moses, where she really picks up on the popularity of genre painting that was perpetuated by the both academic and folk artists that preceded her, particularly the printmakers Currier and Ives, which picked up on the idea of genre painting and really popularized it through lithographs. And then in the 20th century, you see a lot of untrained painters looking at those prints for inspiration and painting their own versions from them. That was a major inspiration for an artist like Grandma Moses. And then Grandma Moses, with her popularity, really spawned a whole generation of people painting in that style and working, I think, within that idiom of showing in realistic terms and naturalistic terms a group of people undertaking some form of activity that really reflected daily life in a particular locale at a particular period in time. In New York State, we find all of the various forms of folk art that we find in the broader Northeast and Middle Atlantic. A lot of artists from New England came here in successive waves, as well as Pennsylvania artists. as well as immigrants from other countries. In terms of artists from New England and Pennsylvania, land in New York State was given away to veterans of the American Revolution. It created what was known as the Yankee Invasion in the early 19th century. New York State, which was heavily Dutch, became very anglicized by the early 19th century. The opening of the Erie Canal, which was a continuous water route from New York City north toward Albany and west to Buffalo, was an incredible east-west migration route, and it caused a lot of people, both immigrants coming into New York, people that were living in New England, people in Pennsylvania, to move to particularly upstate New York, but also New York City, because of the economic opportunities that the canal afforded. And where there are large groups of people who want to get into, mercantile trades, there are going to be a lot of people coming who are involved in the crafts to serve those trades. And so you have a lot of portrait painters coming to New York. You have a lot of stoneware makers and decorators setting up shop along the Erie Canal. You have artists that are doing mural paintings on walls of taverns and homes coming through. You have weavers coming through. It just created this incredible demand that you see with any middle-class mercantile society for the folk art that really served the needs of that society. And it really boomed in New York State from 1825 until at least the 1850s. Beyond the 1850s, you see selected folk art types continuing to survive and others fading. But New York State, for a lot of reasons, is, I think, more diverse than other areas. I think the state's diversity really goes back to the Dutch, philosophy of creating a society that was devoted to business and commercial development, but being very tolerant of religious and ethnic differences. But in America, and in New York State in particular, with New York City being such a port for incoming immigrants, New York State becomes incredibly diverse, ethnically and racially, as we go into the 19th century. And so we see that unlike perhaps the historical art of New England, it's not as homogeneous. You see a lot of different influences, really from the early Dutch, African as well, Irish, Italian. I mean, you just go on and on. A lot of different ethnicities that put down roots here, created works that reflected their communities and the relationship of their communities with American society at large. What you also see in New York, because from the very start it's very commercial, is that often New York State folk art will be somehow bolder, bigger, have broader shoulders than maybe the more elegant folk art of other areas, the more refined folk art that you see either in New England or the South. You'll see, if you compare a New York State album quilt with a Baltimore album quilt, the New York State quilt has bolder lines, bolder colors. You'll see that in painting as well. It becomes broader strokes, sometimes bigger paintings, and it just seems like it's a more aggressive aesthetic statement. That's a broad term, but if you've seen a lot of New York State folk art, I think that really reflects one of the common denominators that it has in comparison to the folk art of other regions. You also see a great diversity in subject because we've got one of the greatest cities in the world. We've got great countryside, and we've got small towns and villages. We've got rural cities, small cities. And so in terms of subject matter, you have New York State folk artists reflecting everything from the very, very urban to the very rural and everything in between. A lot of the folk painters that were coming to the fore in the 1930s and 40s as quote-unquote modern or contemporary primitives, as they were known then, really folk artists, painted in realistic styles. And the artists that we have come to know as outsider artists really weren't as popular in America until later, until the 60s and 1970s. But there's a continual interest in artists that painted with a sense of place and painted realistically and painted everyday life. Really, of course, the spiritual grandmother to them all is Grandma Moses, who was popular beyond belief in the 1940s and 50s. Of course, she died in 1961. But a lot of painters began their painting careers during her lifetime because she really gave a whole generation of Americans the idea that an ordinary person could create great works of art that were also works of great meaning, whether personal or to a community. And you see in the 1960s and 1970s a building of interest in contemporary folk artists that painted in that style. Certainly by the 1980s, there are important exhibitions and galleries devoted to the works of artists that were, in one way or another, influenced by the realism of Grandma Moses. And I think Helen Smeagorinsky falls within this category of this small but very important group of folk painters whose work became very well known by the 1980s, that reflected this very strong sense of community orientation, as well as a really playful eye for detail and color that a lot of audiences really responded to as they responded to Grandma Moses in her time and as they responded to 19th century painters way back in 100 years, 150 years earlier. But what we see really reflected in the interest in contemporary painters like Helen Smeagorinsky is people who had developed an appreciation for folk art and who realized that an untrained painter could bring things to a subject that an academic painter could not. Lively pattern, bright color, lots of detail that a more trained painter might edit out. But in particular, painting a place that no academic painter was painting. You know, Helen's paintings of Brockport, for example, were unique in that way. She was the kind of the community artist and continues to be. We see this in other communities around the United States where, you know, almost every locale had their quote-unquote Grandma Moses, and they really valued that person for what they reflected about the way of life of the place that this community knew best. And now her ties with this community, I think, really fed the authenticity of her art, because when you look at her paintings, like the Fire on Main Street we have in our collection, you may not realize it unless you lived in Brockport, but she shows real buildings. She shows a real event that took place at a particular point in time. And I think that really makes the painting come to life because it gives it a specificity, it gives it an authenticity of detail. It eliminates any sense of the generic that would make it uninteresting, and it becomes a window into a community of people at a point in time that in time really will become important historically, but for today is a great way for people to expand their experience. When they're looking at paintings like this, they can vicariously be a part of the community that's being painted. And so this group of painters that picked up on Grandma Moses in terms of her style and that worked in a similarly realistic style and then really in inventive ways branched off in different directions but still maintained that tie aesthetically and stylistically were very important in the 1980s because they really expanded the audience and the appreciation and the understanding of folk art generally and brought it up to the modern day and began to appreciate the real people who were painting it. And that led to a broader understanding of the creative process because now we had living artists doing this work that could be interviewed, that could be studied, whose work could be shown, and we could really explore in more detail relationships of artists and their communities. And so it became a very important movement, I think, within the larger realm and the historical thread of the study of American folk art generally. And Helen Smeagorinsky, I think, was a very important part of that movement.